Kia ora tātou. Welcome to part 3 of our All Things Carbon webinar series, hosted by BusinessNZ Network and in collaboration with Dita, ThinkStep, ECOS and Toitu Envirocare. Today we are joined by 3 key speakers who are here to take us through the carbon reduction part of our webinar series. So we're up to part 3 of 5. And we're looking forward to hearing all about this from them. As a network, Business New Zealand are moving into the sustainability space. We're on our own journey as well, and we also have a carbon reduction and carbon zero certification commitment by F23. We also want to help our members mobilise in sustainability and address this key challenge of our time. So without further ado on us, I will introduce you to today's speakers. They're going to take you through more about themselves. But first up, we're going to have Ian Challenger speak. He's Carbon Management Team Leader from ECOS. Then we've got Barbara Nebel, who is CEO of ThinkStep ANZ, and followed by Jonathan Pooch from Dita Consulting. He is Managing Director there. The 3 speakers will provide a balanced view with, I guess, some contentious questions and a discussion around carbon reduction. And then we'll move into some question time at the end to allow you time to ask them and make the most of the time we have with them, what your thoughts are. So if we just quickly start, as we have with others, with a poll to get an idea of where you're at in terms of your carbon reduction journey. We just want to know whether, are you reducing your carbon? And we've got a few choices there. So just pick the one that best fits where you're at. Might not be the perfect answer, but we're just keen to get a gauge on where you're at. Cool, we'll let a few more people contribute. Okay, I'm going to end in 3, 2, 1. So majority are actually reducing carbon, have either got a plan, a full plan, or have just done a couple of things in this space. And then there's about 20% who haven't done anything, don't know where to start. So I'll just share those results, which I think I didn't do last time, so that you can see where people are at. And then I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Ian Challenger from ECOS. Welcome, Ian. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. So I'll just share my screen. So yes, welcome. I'm Ian Challenger, as Lauren said, and I'm the team leader from ECOS, looking after the carbon management area. I'm going to talk about the how question around carbon reduction, and following me will be Barbara Nebel, who's going to talk more about the why and the some areas on the target setting, and then we'll finish up with Jonathan, who's going to look at some case studies of work they've done, that Dita's done with some of their clients. So basically, ECOS exists because of the climate crisis, and there is no real doubt that there is a climate crisis now. The temperature is mirroring the increase in CO2 levels quite explicitly, and so a lot of that, or most of that, increase is due to fossil fuels, and that is what ECOS is really all about, trying to reduce, and all of our certifications that we provide, that you can see the logos of there, they all now have a requirement for that people have to have reduction plans in place. So we have the carbon footprint where people just measure their footprint, but also need a carbon plan, a carbon reduction plan. Then they could go on to zero carbon, where they offset 100% of their emissions, but have to have a carbon reduction plan in place. And then the final one is climate positive, where they measure and put a reduction plan in place, and then to offset 120% of their emissions. And so the common theme there, obviously, is, as I said, is reduction plan and having a reduction plan in place. So we have a couple of ways that we work with clients to help them to put a reduction plan in place. All clients get a reduction tool when they undertake one of those certifications with us. Fairly simple tool that we pre-populate with their data on their emissions, and then they can fill it in with the responses. The tool also includes a whole bunch of ideas as to things that they can do, and then they populate this with those examples of the things, who is responsible for those, and then they return that to us. And at the end of the year, they return another copy, but this time filled in with the actions they have taken over that year, so we can see that actions have taken place. The other way that we work with clients is to undertake carbon reduction workshops with in-house, either online or in person. Hopefully with more than just one chap, but usually with a bunch of people from throughout the organisation that get together, and they contemplate where they are now and what actions they can take to work on reductions. What we try and do when we work on a reduction plan is to get organisations to think about where they want to be. So the example here that unfortunately I trialed a photo on top and then it didn't get deleted properly, so sorry about that. But the example here is Interface Carpets, which is a US-based organisation, and they manufacture carpet tiles, and basically they are so closely wedded to the oil industry that they might as well be part of the oil industry. They make a nylon thread into a PVC backing, and they ask themselves the question of how can we improve our product, how can we make something sustainable from the start, rather than just trying to improve their product to make it less bad. And one thing that they did do was to come up with a product called Random, where the tiles are totally random outlines. And the problem with a broadloom carpet, obviously, is that when you get major wear areas where people come into the room and around desks, but by having a random pattern where you can just throw tiles literally onto the floor in any order and they'll look good. The tile are then stuck down at each corner with a sticky tab, so that when an area does wear, they can lift that from the areas, from the tiles from the edges of the room, and put them into the wear areas so that they can then replace those. So it was really thinking about where they wanted to be, to try and be as sustainable as possible. And I'll give another couple of examples of them as we go forward. And as we're going through the workshop, there is no really dumb ideas. People can just come up with anything. Ideas will just feed off themselves. But there are some sort of key questions that we ask people to think about. And one of them, the first one is, does your action move you in the right direction? I mentioned Interface before. One of their big concerns is around the amount of oil that they use, and so they realized that they could start using oil from plant-based materials, and so that did start moving them in a better direction. But it kind of brings us on to the second question, which is your action flexible? because when they realized as they were working on this, yes, it had replaced a lot of their oil by making it plant-based, but that oil was no longer, or the product, the cord, etc., was no longer being able to be used by communities and by livestock. So they had to move away from that, because in another sense of sustainability, it was not a good thing to do. So they were flexible enough in their action to be able to move on to something else fairly quickly. And the third one that we get people to think about is it good value for money? And because it's no good implementing something that's going to cost you a lot of money and putting the business out of business, basically. So it's always key to think about that. So just before I finish, I wanted to say a word on offsetting, because one of the other side that ECOS is involved in is developing offset projects, and we do that, as I say, to contribute to offsetting, to reducing. But there's an impression that a lot of people that offsetting is cheating. If you Google these guys on YouTube, Cheat Neutral, they were a business or a faux business, I should say, that came around in the early 2000s because they wanted to demonstrate that offsetting was cheating, and they invented this faux business that would pay a couple that had been together for donkey's years with money they gained from younger people that were wanting to cheat on their partners. And that way there would be an equal balance of love in the world, and because one was paying the other, and it was a nice story, but it kind of didn't really get to the full understanding of what offsetting was, because really offsetting, it can be cheating if you're not going to do any reductions along the way. But if you just want to try and plant your way out of the problem, there simply isn't enough land on the planet for everyone to offset and keep doing what we're doing now. We have to reduce at the same time. And the key with offsetting is that it can be quite useful in the sense that if there's an area that you can't reduce as an organization, then you can look at offsetting those and offsetting that instead of trying to reduce it right now and wait for technology to come on in the future that will be able to help. So I'm going to stop there and I'll pass over to Barbara. I'll just stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, Ian. That was a really good introduction to what I'm going to talk about now. And I take it you can see my screen on reducing carbon. I'll just move you over here so that I can actually see you. I'm going to talk about a little bit about target setting. I think I've introduced us in the first one. So just a brief recap. We're a team of now about 45, soon 50, working in sustainability across Australia and New Zealand. And a big part of what we do is carbon footprinting, the organizational carbon footprinting. But even more importantly, we identify where does it overlap with other strategies in the business. So where does it overlap with your life cycle assessment, looking at the products you do, looking at the services you provide, looking at responsible procurement, because it all interacts together. And that is quite important when you think about carbon reduction, especially about your supply chain, your scope 3, because there is no way you can reduce your scope 3 emissions if you don't work along your supply chain. A brief recap on what we think the carbon journey is. So it moves from internal reporting to external reporting to reporting with a reduction target and being very transparent on what is that reduction target. How far do you want to go with your reduction? That really is a question. How far up or down with your emissions do we want to go? And this here looks really ambitious. It's more than what I would do. But in terms of carbon, I think it looks a little bit like that for all of us. It's fairly ambitious, but there is a safety rope to actually get us there. And the reward will be good, because the reward of actually going all that far will help us to keep warming below 1.5 degrees for scope 1 and 2, and well below 2 degrees for scope 3. That really is how far we need to go. There isn't much debate in the science anymore. That is just what we need to achieve. And you might go, but when we first talked about Paris, everyone was talking 2 degrees, and now we talk 1.5 degrees. This part, half degree, is a huge amount of difference. It only sounds like half a degree, and when I woke up this morning, a half a degree more or less in my living room wouldn't have made much of a difference, but worldwide it does. Because if we think about extreme heat events, they'll be over 2.5 times as bad if we go to 2 degrees versus if we can keep warming below 1.5 degrees. There is double the amount of biodiversity loss if we go to 2 degrees versus 1.5 degrees. So it really does make a difference, and that is why the general agreement now is we just really do need to keep warming below 1.5 degrees. Now you go, well, how do I know what I have to do to keep warming, to do my bit or to do our bit in our organization to actually keep warming below 1.5 degrees? It's hard enough to actually translate emissions to the warming. And that is where the Science-Based Target Initiative comes in. So science-based targets, they really remove that question of how much we can do and tell us how much we need to do. So I won't go in too much detail of what the Science-Based Target Initiative is, but it's basically an organization of 3 organizations globally who have worked out by how much we actually have to reduce our emissions per sector and as a total to achieve the 1.5 degrees. And there is an option to actually set your target and have it validated by the Science-Based Target Initiative, but not everyone needs to do that. I think it's really useful to use their methodologies and their guidelines on how far, but no one really has to set an approved science-based target. I think the main thing is to actually follow their guidance, and that is pretty simple in words, not as easily done. Is if we want to keep warm below 1.5 degrees, we need to annually reduce our emissions by 4.2 degrees. And that is across the board, everyone, 4.2 degrees per annum. That doesn't mean we have to do 4.2 this year, 4.2 next year. But if we want to work out where do we need to sit by 2030 as an interim near-term goal, it is 9 times 4.2 by 2030. And it is possible to reduce a bit less this year and next if we then have steeper reduction in the following years. In general, we'll talk a little bit about that in the examples, I think, because sometimes we'll still need to wait for some of the technology to be readily available. And it might be in 3-4 years that some more things will come along. You might have to do some investment plans, and that might not be this year or next. But a 4.2 linear reduction by 2030 is really what we need to plan with. And I've mentioned science-based targets. It's quite possible for SMEs to do that. And because it's a global organization, they have a slightly different definition of SMEs. It's actually businesses that have less than 500 employees. So quite a lot of New Zealand businesses would fit into that SME definition under science-based targets. And what does it mean? is that it needs to have absolute scope 1 and 2 reduction targets by 2030, 4.2% linear. And you need to commit and measure and reduce your scope 3 emissions. You don't have to set a scope 3 reduction target if you're an SME and want a science-based target really approved by the Science Based Target Initiative. So that is the SME route for science-based targets. And then what we can help you work out, or others as well, is to work out, okay, if that is our linear reduction line, then what it could look like is, as I said, like just go up a bit, but then go down in your 1.5 degree line. That would be this one here. Because it's quite possible that we first need to invest and then into new technologies and then can start reducing quite significantly later on. When offsetting comes in, you can also mirror your reduction with offsets, and the more reduce, the less you have to offset, of course, to achieve your targets to be, in the end, even carbon positive. We'll talk about that, I think, in the last session. A couple of tools that can help to work out that plan are cost abatement curves, and that is, just don't worry about the small print, but this could be one reduction strategy, and it shows you the savings in energy, which translates into carbon, and the dollar amount that you have to invest. So you can go that far by investing that much. To go a bit further, you have to invest more. This here would be not so much saving, not so much on this axis, but quite expensive. So that is a good way, or quite a lot of investment required for not going very far. But this is a good way of working out how much carbon or energy saving do I have for my investment. So that is what those cost abatement curves are all about. We've shown them slightly differently, might be a bit easier. The bars to the right are actual dollars investment per kilogram CO2 saving. The bars to the left are a no-brainer. They are a saving in dollars per kilogram CO2 saving. So they're really easy ways of working through the opportunities that you have to actually bring your carbon down. And then you can decide what options do you go for, what do you do. And lastly, this will get us then to the 2050 goal of a 90% reduction. So this here is your 2030, where we need to have our 4.2 degrees. And then offsets, if you want to be zero, come in to actually balance out what you can't emit. And the gray part down here is abatements or removals along the way. Those are some of the offsets that Ian mentioned. So in short, you first need to measure, set a target, make sure it's a valid target, start communicating about it, and then track your process. So that really is the ways to set a target. And while it's 4.2, be really ambitious, but also about realistic on what you can achieve by when. And with that, I'll hand over to Jono for some examples.
Awesome, thanks, Barbara. I will just share my screen. Kia ora, everyone. As Barbara said, I'm Jono Pooch, the Managing Director of DETA Consulting. So DETA is a team of around 45 as well, helping to set long-term strategy, but also shorter-term engineering and operational support to develop and scope up some of these projects and activity. But also, we've got a project delivery arm who help work through the actual execution of these projects as well. So something like Reduce is very dear to my heart. We do a lot of work around broader sustainability, but also particularly energy efficiency and fuel transition type projects focused in on those scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. So if I click through, basically for me, Reduce in a nutshell, and we've kind of heard about it from Ian and Barbara already. Obviously, why is this important? Now, hopefully we're not actually having this conversation anymore, but sometimes we still have to have this conversation. So to frame up any sort of strategic transition and the real pivot that all of our businesses need to go through, we do need to very clearly link transition to a why. And that's a strategy and leadership conversation. You know, how does our business position itself in the future to both be sustainable, and by sustainable, I mean holistically sustainable, financially, but also within the world that we're living in. And that's a leadership, market position, all of those sorts of things then become really important. Now, to start that process, we need to know what is the size of the problem? How big is it? We need to understand where we're starting from, and then we can start to understand where we want to get to. Okay, so that's the measurement, carbon footprint. It's our net zero, it's our targets, it's our 1.5 degrees warming. All of those sorts of things frame up the size of the prize or the size of the challenge, and then where are we heading? But ultimately, Reduce is about action. You know, we can't, offsets have a really, really important role to play, but Reduce is about action. We need to do things differently tomorrow than we did today. And how do we do that? Well, focusing in on scope 1 and scope 2 is a great start. And for me, it's about improving our process and system. Are we using energy in a way that we don't necessarily need to? Are we using it in the right way? Are we wasting it? Those sorts of things. Making sure that we're improving our processes, how we're actually operating our business is key step number 1. That has the biggest impact for the lowest cost. Next, we need to make sure we reduce our demand. And I've got energy demand in there because for lots of businesses, energy is the key primary driver of scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, but that might be transportation or it might be supply chain. How do we reduce that demand so that we can do more with less? And then finally, we need to, again, ring fencing energy. What about our source? Can we do something differently? Are we using coal or LPG or natural gas when we could do something slightly differently? So just a few examples of that around the process that people have gone through. Sewers is a customer of ours. They were going through a relatively large rebuild type process. There was a strategic drive from this business, which provides capsicums into the local market, that they want to expand and need to expand capacity, but they want to do that in a sustainable way. They want to do that aligned to 1.5 degree warming. So yes, they want to grow the business and they see the market opportunity, but the status quo that they have always done will not work. Now they approach that by first thinking about their process. They've got process heat, delivering heat into these glass houses. And that is there and it's required for the system to operate, but can they do the system slightly differently? So as part of the expansion, they did look at best practice technology coming out of other areas, particularly out of Europe. But ultimately, they got as far as they could, and then they needed to start thinking about how do we measure what are we actually using right now? And their level of measurement and monitoring and understanding was very, very low. So they started this process of understanding current state. So they've got a current boiler capacity. They now have an actual load. They never knew what their actual load was at any one point in time until they started that measurement type activity. Made efficiency improvements. They installed thermal screens. They installed a ring main. They started sharing load and making sure that they could transition heat between one glass house that had excess heat and one glass house that needed heat. They started this process of energy demand reduction and improvements in efficiency. And then finally, they got the last thing, which was this big crunchy capital step around, actually, we don't want to burn coal anymore. We want to transition into something more renewable like biomass. Now, the key thing here is because they've made all these efficiency improvements, because they've started looking at their process right off the bat, the actual delivered cost of the solution that they came up with was much more cost effective and much more palatable and implementable from a transition perspective. Now, overall, this site has now reduced their carbon emissions by about 90%. So they've identified early that their coal and their thermal energy use was the biggest challenge for them, and they solely focused on reducing that as much as possible and made a really, really big difference. A different example, and again, I'm using a energy-related example, focusing on Scope 1 and Scope 2. We have a meat processing plant. They've got a thermal load requirement, an electricity load requirement, and they are seeing market changes coming at them in the future based on revised meat processing demands and what does the future of meat look like. They still have an obligation to do as much as they can. They started with those efficiency improvements and those processes. They made sure that their cleaning was as most efficient as possible. And there were lots of co-benefits of that. They were starting to focus in on energy, but also by focusing in on cleaning, they reduced their hot water and their water consumption, both in and out of the site significantly. And that has a more holistic view and benefit towards the wider sustainability. They started installing high temperature heat pumps. HTHP is high temperature heat pumps. So they started doing that with the improved efficiency, getting away from coal and getting away from non-renewable thermal fuel for process heat. And then they started looking at, could I transition towards biomass or electricity? But both of those had their own challenges. The reality is that there is an economic challenge to some of this transition that we are talking about. And what they ended up coming up with was a mixed solution where they're using some electricity and some biomass, and they're trying to plant some biomass resource now to allow them to both improve biodiversity on the site, but also to provide some fuel for the site from a process heat perspective in a sustainable, renewable, replanted type way in the future. So they've really, again, started from that place of measurement, understanding how big the challenge is, working their way through the efficiency, getting the low-hanging fruit, those easy wins, and then starting the bigger, more challenging things as they've gone along their journey. Now, just a few, and Ian had a few tips and tricks as well. You know, this is quite typical of the sorts of outputs that we're working with on these long-term sort of decarbonisation type roadmaps. So we're looking here at capital investment versus carbon savings. We've got the marginal abatement cost curves, but the important thing here is it's aggregated over time. So we can start to understand from some of these charts, are we on track for our 4% and a bit year-on-year improvement? Are we above or below the line? Are we making sure that we're doing this in a cost-effective way? And as you can see with that graph on the right, we've got some big crunchy capital investments to make here along the way. How are we handling those? How are we communicating those? Are we delivering the marginal cost abatement that then makes these things palatable? At what ETS price can we actually trigger some of these investments perhaps earlier than we might? And one of the emerging things that we are doing a lot of work on at the moment is actually this concept of reinvestment. So, you know, we all want to move more quickly, but this concept of economics are a bit of a barrier for us. This concept of reinvestment, where we are making improvements, we are making energy savings, carbon savings, and often they translate into dollar savings as well, particularly in the energy space. So let's reinvest some of those savings in the next project that we are starting to work from. And that's the difference between that red line and the black line. And you can see over time, our cumulative savings from some of this activity can outstrip the cumulative investment. And that's something that we're seeing more and more, particularly with the current pricing for the ETS and where that pricing might go in the future. So I guess there are some key takeaways before I hand it over to some questions. And I'm focused in here on Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. We have to align to a broader business strategy. You cannot do sustainability or decarbonisation in complete isolation to what else is happening in the business. That leads to greenwashing. It leads to focusing in on the wrong things. It leads to this split personality within these businesses. So it actually needs to be part of you and your business rather than something extra that you do. The really key concept here, often I talk to people and they think of decarbonisation as a project. It is not a project, it's a program of work. Success will not be driven by one project, 1 year, one activity. This is something that we will continue to work on to 2030, to 2050, and probably beyond. This is a long-term transition. It's a transition, not necessarily a transformation. We need to move quickly, but we need to gear up for this longer-term body of work that needs to be chipped away at over time and time again. 4.2% per year to meet our science-based targets. We need to keep chipping away at it regularly. The immediate challenge, particularly in the Scope 1 and Scope 2 space, is strategic and economic, not technical. You know, too often I think people fall back on these technical challenges. The technology's not yet available. I would challenge that a lot. You know, from a technical perspective, we have the ability to strip 70, 80, even 90% of carbon out of these businesses. The challenge is doing it in an economically prudent way and aligning it with that broader strategy. To do that, we need to change our thinking. How can we align measurement, verification, strategy to real action? And that's where the Carbon Reduction Action Plan is mission critical, understanding the options available, focusing in on the biggest opportunities and making sure that we are investing in the right things at the right time to make our transition in a timely way to meet our broader targets and the world's broader targets. And simplistically, that's all I've got. I know I've thrown quite a bit at you, and I know we've all thrown a bit at you. And now I'll hand it back to Lauren to facilitate some questions and discussion.
Thanks very much, Jono, Barbara and Ian. That was very helpful. There's a lot that's come our way. So I'll just hand it over to the audience for questions. You're welcome to put your hand up. You can put questions in the chat. And yeah, who's first? Oh, hang on, we've got one from Rachel already. Can you explain, please, what you mean by biomass effluent turned into fuel, for example? Maybe Jono, so you mentioned biomass.
Yeah, so biomass predominantly, I was thinking solid fuel biomass, so that might be wood chips or wood pellets or hog fuel, is a replacement or a substitute fuel for other solid fuel type options. There is quite a lot of opportunity for biogas, which is more a gas-based fuel, which might be an opportunity to replace natural gas type systems, and that uses a little bit more processing through wastewater and the treatment of wastewater potentially, or other waste streams, often done in conjunction with existing energy suppliers to get economies of scale a little bit. Yeah, but basically looking towards closing the loop on a shorter term carbon cycle, if you like, rather than taking coal out of the ground.
Cool, thank you. And just building on, well, not exactly building on biomass, but the examples you gave were sort of more kind of processing or operational based businesses. What about for office based businesses? Can you suggest a few core areas that would likely be material for office based businesses?
Yeah, sure. I mean, our business itself is office-based business, and so some of the things that we are focusing in on is our fleet. So transportation is quite a key part of what we do, and a lot of that, you know, those same principles apply. Why are we traveling? For a start, so in this day and age, can we do more of our communication and conversations via video conference? And then when we are traveling, can we rationalize logistics? If I have 2 or 3 people going into the center of the city, can they travel together, or can we align timeframes a little bit? I know a lot of work New Zealand Post have been doing has been around trying to sort of optimize those routes that they're dropping off the packages, or maybe asking customers, maybe we could just drop off to you on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays rather than having to drop off to you every day. So thinking about those processes and systems and reducing that demand. But equally, then at the final point is, are we using utes? And I mean, we don't, but are we using utes for what we need utes for? Or can we do our duty with low emissions vehicles, hybrids, electric vehicles, that sort of thing? So that transportation is a key focus for us. There are scope 3 emissions that we are focusing in on around travel, which has some very similar themes for air travel in particular, around really questioning the need to be there face to face. And then obviously offices still use electricity and water and some of those fundamental things. And there is always more you can do around LED lights, optimizing heating and ventilation, all of those sorts of things to minimize demand as much as possible. But you need to understand how big the prize is and where to focus in based on that initial measurement and understanding your baseline carbon footprint.
I'll add to that because it's exactly the same for us. We are an office-based organization, and we did set a science-based target now about 4 years ago. Back then, we were a much smaller organization, and our science-based, our emissions scope 3 was really just travel. It mainly was travel. Then, of course, COVID hit, and travel has gone right back. But we've kept travel down because we hardly fly anymore. Back then I would have been in Sydney twice a month, but we now have a team lead there. So it's also about strategically positioning people so that you can reduce travel. Now I could go to Sydney and I don't have to anymore because we've got the right person now in the location. And for all New Zealand travel, we really significantly reduce that. I now do sometimes a week or more than half a week in Auckland, but would drive instead of fly. So there is a lot that can be done in terms of travel by thinking about it more strategically.
Just building on that a bit, I guess speaking with the office space theme, as a result of the business disruption from COVID and significantly more flexibility and working from home models, like many businesses, I guess footprint or way of operating has been challenged in terms of frequency staff are at work and how much they're using facilities and things. Do any of you have examples from either yourselves or clients of shifts that have happened that have also facilitated carbon reduction as well, and how businesses have navigated that?
It'll be published soon. We've done some work on how much, at least even just one day working from home will reduce overall travel. It's about 20% because if you have a 5-day week, one work day from home is actually quite a reduction. Then of course you have to take some additional carbon into account because suddenly their whole house will be heated all day, where it might not have been before. So those things come into play as well. But okay, lost my thought of train here. My train of thought. Maybe someone else can jump in and answer the question.
Does anyone
working from home?
Sorry,
working from home. So yes, the trick is to have a roster, to have enough people meeting each other, but not holding office space, so that one day a week that everyone would be in the office, but still to making sure everyone can meet everyone. Because otherwise you'll end up heating a lot more office space and pay for a lot more office space than you need if you have a mix of in-office and hybrid working.
Mm-hmm. Cool, thank you. I'm just going to kind of read out an answer that occurred in conversation in the chat, just so that everyone is across it. There was a question around, is the 0.2% science-based target emissions reduction by 2030, just scope 1 and 2 emission reductions? And the answer is yes for SMEs, SMEs being under 500 businesses, but also a commitment to reduce scope 3 and communicate this as well. So I'm just, I guess, replaying that live in case anyone hasn't scrolled kind of through the chat. There's a bit of conversation around terminology, so we'll come to that in a second. I'll see if we can share some kind of glossary of terms. One thing I think that that would be useful to ask. Okay, cool. So there's someone's put a glossary there, and I'll share that one from ThinkStep. I think there was mention of ETS and ETS prices. We're aware of the challenge of cost of living, and the cost of carbon also rises. I know, Barbara, in previous sessions, you've sort of also said that carbon follows the dollar often, in terms of, if you save carbon, you save money as well. Any comment around, I guess, all of those themes around the cost of carbon, the cost of offsets, the importance of acting now versus later in light of that, all of those kind of cost elements? Would that be you, maybe Jono or Ian, or I think, Barbara, you went to answer that.
Yeah, I've got an example, and that is, again, what can an SME, an office-based SME, do? We have been, for the last 5 or 6 or even longer years, always bought second-hand laptops for staff. They're a lot cheaper. You still get a 2-year warranty with them. Saves carbon because it's pre-used, and does save money. So that's a really easy one to do. Those laptops have been leased to some of the large businesses for a year. They come back, got a lot of life in them, so no one actually has to buy a brand new laptop. But I wouldn't recommend buying secondhand from Trade Me, but there are shops that actually sell refurbished secondhand laptops.
Interesting. That's a good example. Jono or Ian, do you have any build on either that as an example or the broader question?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the broader question, in simplistically, at a true macro level, you can't have carbon reduction in the current economy. So the whole economy really does need to be transformed, and it will, if we achieve these goals, which I'm certainly committed to, and all of the panelists here are committed to being enablers to that, but the economy will look very different in 2050 to what it does today. And I think the challenge at a government and policy level is you cannot have an ETS price at $180 per tonne without supporting social policies that then make sure that this gap between, cost of living gap isn't getting more and more broad, because there's a disproportionate impact on those who simply can't afford it. So that's a real challenge for the government, and a real challenge for NZ Inc. and governments around the world, is to do this in a way that, yes, we need to pivot the economy, but we also need to bring everyone along the journey in a just, fair transition. I think that's really important. It's quite hard to do from an action-oriented perspective at an individual level, but that's we've all got that opportunity potentially next year at the voting booth. But I think, from a business perspective, the point and the aim of the marginal abatement cost curves is to understand the relative cost of these options that you have to decarbonise your system, or your site, or your organisation. And clearly you want to start with the ones that have the lowest marginal abatement cost. That's kind of why you do the curve. So often we are seeing, the future of for these organisations will be and could be lower cost in today's terms based on this decarbonisation transition. The challenge is that there's quite a lot of investment that then needs to go along with that to achieve that transition. And so it becomes a question of timing. It becomes a question of existing asset and infrastructure life. I mean, to Barbara's example around the computers, you can also hold your computers a little bit longer as well, which I think is a great example. Let's extend the life of them a little bit longer. But when we do renew them and replace them, let's make sure that we're making a great decision at that point in time around, how we're reviewing and choosing our new computers. I talk to people all the time around car leases. It does my head in. It's kind of a standard 3-year lease. well, there's still quite a lot of value in a good 3-year-old car. One of the best things we could do is actually make that 3-year lease a 4-year lease. Make it a nice, easy buy-in option for that staff member to purchase that vehicle. So when we start thinking holistically and challenging that status quo around the holistic carbon footprint and the carbon impact of some of our decisions, then we don't necessarily keep doing the same thing time and time again.
Great, thanks, Jono. I guess just linked with that as well, you mentioned reinvesting, obviously, in the cost savings that you generate, or once you've addressed the low-hanging fruit, reinvesting them to help fund a transition pathway. Beyond that, acknowledging some of these initiatives do require capital, do you or any of the panelists know, or would you profile a couple of sources of funding that are available for SMEs in this space?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think for mine, the best option for a SME is to be really clear around the measurement and actually doing this funding, obviously yourself. It's going to be the lowest cost source of funding, and ring fence what are those savings and then reinvest that next year. Beyond that, we're seeing quite a lot of movement actually from the banks themselves. We have a lot of conversations with basically the major banks. They are looking for more investable sorts of projects in this space, and certainly, you know, they've started to get some ring fence funding. They've started to get a little bit of funding at lower cost than standard as well. So we've worked on a couple of projects where we've helped to facilitate, you know, for quite small businesses, access to low cost capital through their existing lending type institutions. And then we are seeing a little bit more peer-to-peer type lending opportunities, and the green investment finance is another potential avenue for some smaller businesses as well. But I think this sort of funding opportunity is something that is still in development. You know, that we are seeing a lot of transition and change in this space, and funding is certainly one of them. The Energy Efficiency and Conservation Authority have quite a lot of new funding streams coming online, and there's certainly some potential for SMEs to start to access some of that through multiple channels and opportunities for funding for low emission vehicles, or for transitioning process heat, or for new technology demonstration. There's now government funding available to help support all of that, at down to quite small SME type level as well.
And just on that, do you have a view on, there's a question from, can't see the person's name, I think it's actually from Tim, on energy certificates, a view on energy certificates to incentivise new investment in renewable electricity and gas.
Do you want to take that one, Ian?
I'm not sure I've got an answer, to be honest. We do accept them in our program, in terms of recognising them as an offset, but I can't really comment on whether they've increased the level of investment in renewable energy as a nation.
Great, thank you. I think just broadening out for a last but not least sort of question area, and thank you, I had it on my notepad, but I think Jamie's prompted it as well, around behaviour change. So obviously we talk about technology, there's carbon reduction, there's abatement curves and everything, but at the heart of all of this, at the centre, is the need to transition and transform from a people perspective. So just keen for a view from each of the speakers on what you're seeing as the key ways to mobilise people and drive that behaviour change, and what you're seeing in common across clients and businesses as being most effective. So do you want to start? Should we go Ian, Barbara, Jono?
Yeah, I guess there are, I mean, the way we always approach this with businesses is to look at their, what we call the hotspots, look at their emissions once they've measured their footprint, we identify the areas that are the highest emitting areas, and then get the participants of the workshop or in their own work to think about the things that they can do around those specific areas of the highest one, to try and get the biggest bang for their buck, if you like. And those hotspots really, there is common, I guess there's common themes, but there's nothing really, because every organization is different in terms of what they do and how they function and so on. So for some, it's going to be electricity that's the biggest, whereas another will have electricity well down the line, and it might be a scope 3 emission freight, for example, that is their big area. Yeah, so it's quite hard to say whether there are common themes. Electricity does come up time and time again. Travel does come up time and time again. And for a lot of organizations, freight comes up, which is obviously a scope 3 and a much trickier area for people to think about reducing because there's less opportunity for an organization to address freight that they have because they're dependent on another organization. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Ian. Barbara, do you have a view on the role of or what's effective in terms of the behaviour change required to enable such a transition?
I think it's people. It's actually people talking to each other. I've got one example. I've met with the CEO of a business, medium-sized business, not tiny, and he said, oh, you need to help me. We need to have a sustainability strategy. I'm not so convinced really all this climate change, but my board is asking for it. Our clients are asking, and my staff is knocking on my door. And so he gets a pressure from all sides that they have to come up with a sustainability and carbon strategy. And he took that on board, and a lot of that was the pressure from staff. I met with him now a year later because they want to do things, they want to take things further. And then I needed to leave to another meeting. He said, oh, I'll give you a lift. And he said, aren't you proud of me for now having an EV? And so the guy who was really quite skeptical, had a lot of pressure from supply chain as well as staff, really turned around. And I do think it is actually that people talking have the greatest power in convincing those who do really need to lead that behavior change.
Thanks, Barbara. Last but not least, Jono.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, for me, building on that theme, people changes or any change management is difficult, and it requires humble, open leadership and having the ability to have a two-way dialogue and make that change one-on-one, but also from a leadership perspective, being comfortable in the unknown as well. We don't have all the solutions for climate change or for some of this transition. Whilst we can do lots of things right now, and lots of these things can be done cost effectively, we know what the end point is, but we don't necessarily know the journey or the how we're going to get there. And that's actually okay. And I think being open from a leadership perspective to communicate that to the team from a business perspective or at home or wherever, and go, look, we're up for the challenge. You know, we need your ideas. This will change over time. But we've got to start, because if we don't start and we don't start reducing today, that 4.2%, if we do none this year, that then becomes 5% we need to start hitting over this 8-year period rather than 4.2 over a 9-year period. You know, we have to make this transition and we have to get started. And I think going on the journey together, leading on the journey together is such a key part of that for mine.
Great, thank you, Jono. Well, with that, I will wrap this up and bring this to a close. I think we've heard some great things from all our speakers today. Thank you again, Ian, Barbara and Jono from ECOS, ThinkStep ANZ and DETA as part of our All Things Carbon series. It's, as you've heard, it's really important to not only start this journey, but to take a step rather than no steps. beginning with measuring and taking stock of where you're at, to then strategically thinking about the best way to that you can approach reduction that's aligned with your business and your strategy, that brings your people on board, not just your own people in your business, but your suppliers, your customers, and your other competitors or other people in your industry as well. And importantly, to go quickly and together. So we have a couple of other parts to the series coming from here, which the next one is Offset on the 5th of August, and then we've got Climate Positive and Science-Based Targets on the 12th of August. There's a few people who have questioned around terminology and glossary. I will send that out afterwards. But speaking of Climate Positive and SBTIs and also people, we're really keen. We're going to put together a panel of people for that session. We want to respond to what you need and what you want to know. So if you can please reach out to me, my email's on the screen, ljames@businessnz.org.nz, and let me, on behalf of us, know what you want out of that session. I imagine part of it is what Climate Positive actually is, will be a good starting point. But beyond that, tell us what you need, what you want to hear, and we will tailor the session for that. So please let us know. But in the meantime, thanks again for your participation and presence. And we also thank you in advance for your either continued or started action in the space. And all of us are here to help support that in our various capacities as well. So thanks again for coming. Hopefully see you again soon, and the recording will be sent out as well. Ka kite anō.